Okay, so the last thing that I want to do when I'm talking about family is to give you those three major sociological perspectives, the kind of things that they might be interested in if they were looking at the family of a society. Functionalists, you can probably guess, and I think particularly when we start to talk about social institutions, that the idea of functionalism just makes a whole lot more sense. Functionalists are interested in the function of society, of family in society. What is it supposed to be doing? And as an extension, how is that particular society answering the call of family? How are they doing it? And is the thing that they're doing being functional? Is it providing function for society, or is it providing a dysfunction for society? Again, and when you think about the debates that we might have about families and family structure and family, sort of legally what we count as family or not family, usually brings the functionalists out of us. And the basis of what we're talking about is, what do we think the function of society is supposed to expect from families? What is the family function? And are we doing that? So it asks us to define what we think family should be about. Family has the function of stabilizing society. And so we care about who lives where. We care about who do you consider to be your family versus just your kin. Who are you taking care of or not? Those are very sometimes legally specified constructs because we have to answer those questions. We have to have a decision-making process when it comes to things like economic responsibility, or when it comes to things like the inheritance of somebody's assets, or when people get married, now something that you own becomes, the belongings of your spouse. Or when you get divorced, now who owns what? Like, those are real questions that we can't make new decisions case by case basis. So functionally, we care about it. It really drives home this idea between, informal norms and formal norms. We got to come up with the rule about that. And so one of the things that I do want you to take away is this idea that half of all marriages end in divorce. That's so 100% not true. It's a misreading of the data. It considers, like, let's say 100 couples got married in 2024. If we saw that the rate of divorce is 50 couples got divorced also in 2024, half of the marriages that happened in 2024 didn't end in divorce because it wasn't those 100 couples and 50 of them got divorced. Now, that's not to say that our divorce rates aren't higher than they used to be. Clearly, they are. We've changed some things legally as to how people can get divorced, who and when people can get divorced, and we've changed some things over time religiously, or social and cultural attitudes based on religions as expectations or not. So people do get divorced much more than they used to. People get married a lot less than they used to. People get married older than they used to. People get married sometimes and don't have children, or they have children much later than they used to, or they have children and they never get married. All of those kinds of questions beg us to wonder, what is it that we expect from family, and how do we sort of control for what it is that we expect, because we need to be able to answer the question, oh no, this is chaos and we don't want chaos, or when is it going to chaos so that we can keep it from going to chaos, or are we finding changes that are okay, they're just changes. So those are always the kinds of questions that we're interested in. And that's why these sort of rules and distinctions matter for sociologists and for functionalists in particular. Social conflict theorists are looking at sort of what the function of society is, but in particular, how is family functioning to create and perpetuate social inequalities? It is the basic unit of society. So if we want to understand the inequalities of society, one of the best places that we can look at that is what's happening in the family unit. When we talk about those, family patterns, when we talk about GAMY, like who's marrying whom, and whether or not you can marry one person or marry multiple people, and who's taking care of whom, or especially cultural attitudes of endogamous relationships within social categories, or exogamous relationships outside of social categories. That matters a lot when you're talking about the sort of stratification of society and what that means for life chances or social outcomes. So if you think about it, again, if we can recognize by socioeconomic status that we are a class-based open stratification system, which says there's nothing to keep you from moving classes, right? The truth is that higher class, higher upper class, particularly wealthy people are going to likely marry other higher class, particularly wealthy people. Not only is it practically not likely that the super duper rich is going to even come into contact with the super not rich in order to form the kind of patterns and bonds that might lead to marriage. That's not happening. So what winds up happening is that rich people tend to marry other rich people. Poor people tend to marry other poor people. Middle class people tend to marry other middle class people, particularly in their level of middle class. So what you have in the stratification system is nothing that legally says that you can't move from one class to another, but marital patterns, residential patterns, tend to perpetuate the inequality that's already there. And so you just don't see people moving outside of that. And when we have this question or these social attitudes about what we consider to be exogamous, there's nothing that keeps a super rich person from marrying a super poor person, but it is so exogamous that they're not going to receive support from their families, for instance. No parent of a super, super rich child wants to think that he or she is going to marry someone who might just be trying to take advantage of them. You know, like every made-for-TV movie has that part of the plot, right? That's an exogamous relationship that's not likely to receive very much social support. So you're just not going to see it. We've seen the same thing again in social attitudes, but also in legal rules that say it was not possible for people to marry interracially. So when we think about stratification based on race, it means that whatever the life chances are for people at the bottom of that stratification system, those minorities that have been singled out and, you know, receiving these disadvantages or not being included in the advantages and privileges, they're not going to get them once they get married either, because they're not marrying out of the group where they're already in. And so even when we get rid of that rule, remember we said when we're talking stratification, we can get rid of the legal barriers, but we don't exactly change the way the society is operating. White people tend to marry, by and large, white people. Black people, by and large, tend to marry Black people. Rich people tend to marry rich. Poor people tend to marry poor. Urban people tend to marry urban. Rural tends to marry rural. And what you get in the effect of that is a lot of times culturally, sometimes legally, the perpetuation of that same social stratification or economic stratification, because you just don't get very much differences around there. And so the family becomes very useful when we talk about stratification of society based on gender, for instance, right? Because we're talking in marriages and families, typically male and typically female bodies that come together, have sex, have babies, take care of one another emotionally and economically. But what you also see is power dynamics that happen in the household, that start in the household, that are reflected in society, or the power dynamics that are in society trickle down and then are reflected in the household. So we've talked about this division of labor based on gender or sex. Sexual differences between typical male and typical female bodies certainly boil down to actual physiological differences and what that might mean for reproduction. But we've also said that that gender division of labor usually favors males or men bodies in societies. And so that's what we tend to see in the households. So social conflict theorists might really be interested in what is happening in families, because it is where we divide the gender first and foremost. It is where we have expectations of grown men and grown women in their households and their families and in their sort of economic responsibilities also reflected into the house, into the larger society. But then that is where we're socializing the children to teach them first and foremost about their gender and developing their gender identity and their understanding their expectations of who and what they are going to be in society based on their gender. So social conflict theorists are very interested, or might be very interested in how family is functioning in society. One of the distinctions that we get from family that we see reflected as a whole in society are these words like matriarchy and patriarchy, H usually is the suffix of a word when we're talking about power and authority. Matriarchy is the rule of the mother. Patriarchy is the rule of the father. So just like when we studied or talked about lineage patterns and residential patterns, now we're talking about power dynamics. Who is the person who's in charge in a household of two? Think about the dyad. It's only two of them. Who gets to break the tie? Who gets to make the final decision? Whose rule is the final rule? In a patriarchal household, which is typically what we see traditionally in the United States and most of the world, in a patriarchal household, you follow the rules of the father. In a matriarchal household, you follow the rules of the mother. On a society level, matriarchy is a thing, but it's almost talked about in a hypothetical way because you don't usually see it. Even in societies that follow lineage through the mother's line, sometimes still is a very patriarchal society. And so how you understand that is important. The thing that's also interesting when you talk about neo-local patterns of the residential patterns, sometimes what you get are new families of procreation who are neo-local, which means they don't live with either side of their families, who sometimes attempt this egalitarian power structure. And to be egalitarian in this sense means that the spouses regard themselves as equal to one another in their power or in their decision making. And this is, again, one of those examples where the older generations, for instance, might be up in arms into these neo-local residential patterns because not only are they living somewhere, they're attempting to sort of undermine the rule of the father in those households. Those households are going around trying to equalize their power and decision making. And sometimes, people of new generations specifically move away from their parents so that they can break those cycles or do something different. And while that is definitely a symbol of change, and I consider personally a commendable thing to do, one of the difficult things of trying to do that is because your pattern of residence is so separate from your family, is that you don't always even know how to be egalitarian. You don't have any no rules to follow, no cultural expectations. You don't know what's expected of you, and you have no models. Or one of the sort of role conflicts that people face is they might, want to be or try to be egalitarian in that household, but they've been socialized in a non-egalitarian way, and the society around them is not egalitarian. So you try to maintain this thing in your house that may not have matched your upbringing and may not even match what's outside of your house. But again, the household or the family is of strict interest to social conflict theories when we're talking about how are families operating and in what ways are they struggling with creating or perpetuating the social inequalities of society. So the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of these three are symbolic interactionists. And the only thing that I really want to say about that, excuse me, is remember that symbolic interactionists care about the meaning that we assign to things and what that means for how we interact with one another. And that definition or that distinction between who's our kin and who's our family is important. Again, you might be found on Facebook by somebody who's related, once removed from your father, and they say, hey, we're related and your family. Or, that's cool. You might become Facebook friends, but you're not showing up for the birthday parties. You're not really changing who you're getting Christmas gifts for because you're related and that's great. And maybe you'll develop a relationship, but you don't consider them to be your family. So one of the questions about that is that there's not usually rules about that. Really, it's meaning. Who do we consider to be our family? And that's sometimes such an emotional and guttural thing that is guiding who we believe that we are economically responsible for or economically beholden to, or who we should expend any of our emotional resources on. That's usually a family or a meaningful kind of thing, culturally, sometimes religiously. But again, it's the values that we sort of understand. So we have a sense of who do we consider to be our family? We feel some kind of way about that. We have a sense about who we call our brothers or our sisters and what kinds of things we expect of that. We can talk about what a good mother is or what a good father is. And very early, we're talking meanings. I think one of the questions that I like to see on the internet is, what do you call your mom's best friend's children? And you might call them your cousins. And they're clearly not your cousins. If you pull that chart out of kinship, they're not your cousins at all. But we call them our cousins because we try to have some way to talk about the kind of meaning that they have to us and to our family as if they are our cousins. Sometimes we talk about the family that you are born into, your family of origin, and the family that you choose, like who's your best friend and their family. You might call your bestest friend your sister or your brother. And so we use these family terms to understand the meaning of those relationships. And your best friend might provide those same emotional needs and those same economic needs for you, and vice versa, at the rate of, or even more than, your own blood or marriage or adopted family. And so, how do you not call them your family? So, symbolic interactionists, in that case, by example, would be very interested in the kind of meanings that we associate with family and those family relationships and how those distinctions might matter. Okay, so that's the last thing I want to talk about with family. Thanks for watching.